Anders Liu-Lindberg, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Patrick. Happy to be here.
We're really happy to have you. As has become customary, the best place to start is maybe just to have you introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your background and what you do now.
Yes, thanks, Patrick. So my name is Anders Liu-Lindberg. I'm a partner at a company called Business Partner Institute, and we help finance functions all over the world elevate their influence in their companies through business partnering. I also have a blog on LinkedIn with more than 150,000 subscribers, and I basically just put out content on a daily basis to try and help finance and accounting professionals all over the world succeed in their careers. So that's a bit about me.
We're going to dive into that content because it's made my life really easy preparing for the podcast, just being able to look through what you've already written about. Could you just tell us a little more about business partnering?
So business partnering is really a concept where, finance, but also other functions, they have to figure out how do we bring the insights in play from our analysis, from the numbers, if we're talking about finance, with business leaders in sales and marketing and operations to help them make better decisions. So we really just say insights times influence equal to impact. So insights is all the numbers and the new perspectives we have to make these better decisions. Your influence is your ability to build relationships, speak in a language that the business understand, and communicate your insights so you get a yes from these busy executives. And if you have insights and you have influence, you have impact, which is value creation, shareholder value creation in most companies, but whatever value creation definition that you have, that you get through better decision making and stronger execution. So that's business partnering in a nutshell.
And what does your day job look like?
So my day job is kind of diverse, I would say, but most often I would have engagement with clients. That could be training programs, it could be consulting jobs to help them set their organization or create a framework for business partnering so people understand what does this mean and what do I need to do differently. And of course I create a lot of content and engage with lots of people, because I also let's say do marketing on what we do, but it's really just about telling what business partnering is, telling where's finance heading in the future, and then helping people like that.
And that's what motivates you to create so much content specifically on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm very much purpose-driven to just help anyone out there be successful. And of course, I can't help everyone personally. I have more than 67,000 followers right now, and of course lots of people are sending me messages and I'm stuck in my career, can you help me find a job, and what should I do about this, that and the other. And of course it's grown to a point where I just can't cater individually to it. So I really just try to help people through the content, and then of course if they comment or engage with the content, I will respond in kind, but that's really why it's the best way for me to help everyone out there that needs helping.
Have you always been a finance person?
I've always worked in finance, except for a short stint in HR when I was a student. And it's it's a funny story, right? Because I was in finance, at least to begin with, as a student, and then I really liked that about working with people and helping the companies find the right people. So I moved into HR still as a student, because I thought working strategically with HR that sounded pretty cool to me. But working in that HR function, it was sort of like an engineering company with engineers and whatnot. And those engineers, they told me, not directly because I was in HR, but they just said, these HR people kind of just stay out of my life. I can find my own people. They just need to make sure it's posted and then send me everyone that applies. And I was like, that's not nice to have a job that people are talking about you or your role like that. So I went back into finance thinking I'm not going to spend the first 10 years of my career trying to convince people all the good that HR can do. But of course, what do I find in finance? It's exactly the same, right? Business people think about finance in the same way. Just stay out of my business, just send me the report with the numbers and I'll figure it out. And you can't keep running forever, so I sort of took a stand and say, okay, let me try finance, see how it goes, because I'm good with numbers and I like working with business. So I'll try it out, and then I ended up spending the first 10 years of my career trying to convince people all the good that finance can do. And here we are, because finance can do a lot of good.
Well, let's get into that. That was a perfect segue. I wanted to sort of touch on, as I said, the content that you've put out recently. And one of the really interesting things that you published on LinkedIn was your New Year's speech, where you sort of detailed a lot of trends, things that we saw in the last year, but more importantly, trends for 2022. Obviously, one of the first things that caught my eye is this term that you use a lot, both in that piece of content and in other content, the finance function of the future, which is sort of, you tell me if I'm wrong, but that building the finance function of the future is one of your key aims.
Yeah.
What is the finance function of the future?
So I think the term I really use now is like finance function 4.0, of course building on the industry 4.0, but really just to say that, there's a lot of transactions and a lot of things that we need to do in finance for compliance and controlling purposes. Those are not necessarily the things that are adding value to a company. So we need to first digitalize, if not already, and then automate all these transactional processes to free up time for generating insights that we can influence business leaders with to make better decisions. Because that's what we should be doing. But if you go back, 5, 10, 20 years, it's not really what we have been doing. So that's the future where we need to create that say, if finance can unlock this, there's an immense value potential just lying there for the taking. I call it typically the $1 trillion opportunity. Now, I think if every finance and accounting person was a good business partner, we could increase the global EBIT or EBITDA, whatever measure you want to use, with 1 to 2 percentage points. That's probably $1 trillion, I would say. That's why we call it the $1 trillion opportunity. And that's the future to me, that it's much more human-to-human interaction, and the numbers are generated automatically, so it's about using the number for making better decisions.
I think most of the CFOs that we speak to, at least, recognize that for sure, that need to automate and move away from a lot of the smaller transactions. What do you think's preventing that today?
So I think, with the whole pandemic and everything that we've seen in the past couple of years, I think actually it's starting to move, at least on the transactional side. So there was a book or ebook put out by Accenture earlier, back into 2021, where it said from 2018 to 2021, the rate of automation of transactional tasks in finance had gone from 34% to 60%. That's a massive change in such a short period, because you and I, we both know we've been talking about automation for 20 years, probably even longer, but not a lot has happened. And now suddenly, maybe because of the pandemic, probably, maybe because of other things, it just happened. And of course we can go further than 60%, but this is massive. So things are actually starting to move, I would say. But of course, it's not just about automating the transactional processes. It's also about, planning and analytics and, big data and data science and, predicting the future and all this stuff, which is what we're getting into now, I think. What's stopping us? There's nothing really that should be stopping us, because all the tools, all the methods are really available. So it's much more about how do we apply it in our companies. But I think, if we go 5-10 years back, there's the more traditional finance people, those that maybe were brought up in either auditing or accounting, where it's much more about, not taking risk and making sure everything is compliant. And then, you go into a much more uncertain space where you can't say, well, this should be 99% correct before we can send it through. Now you're more like, okay, if I can be 80% correct, it's actually pretty good. And that is sort of like an internal change that needs to happen, and that's hard. I can tell you, Patrick, this is what needs to happen. You can say, yes, Anders, that makes a lot of sense. And inside you're feeling like, but I'm not really comfortable going from 99% to 80%. And I think that's really what's happening, that we are trying to get comfortable with this new uncertain reality. So nothing is stopping us, we just need to get comfortable with it.
Do you think there'll be a moment where we'll be able to look and sort of say, all right, we've reached 4.0, it's widespread, or is it always just a matter of transitioning to the next thing?
I think, probably some consultants will come up with a new term before we even reach there, right? That's how we keep things moving in society. But I think, it's a good target to have right now, and say, now we always make, strategies and visions for finance, and sometimes you are a few years in, sometimes you're starting from scratch. So I think if you're starting from scratch today, getting to finance function 4.0 is where you need to be. but in 2-3 years it might be that, maybe we call it something else, but the target keeps moving, because it's not an absolute game, right? It's a relative game against your competitors. Just like in business, it's the same in finance. Is your finance function a competitive advantage, or is it dragging you down? That's what business leaders and CEOs are asking themselves. Is finance helping me, or is it holding me back? So it's a constant moving target, and finance leaders out there, they need to be sure that they're improving, relatively speaking, towards their competitors.
You had a LinkedIn poll with thousands of votes, and I think this is sort of what you were touching on just before. In the poll, you sort of asked what was holding finance teams back, and the winning vote, the leading result, was mindset rather than processes, tools, or people. Is that sort of that's what you were talking about just before? It's this idea of switching the mindset that a lot of finance leaders are still struggling with.
Absolutely. It was very interesting when I made that poll. I was like, so there's the mindset, there's systems, there's processes, and then also put people in terms of, training, and do we actually have the skills to do it? Because, skills is different from the mindset. And I was thinking to myself, it's probably going to be systems or processes, because that's something external from ourselves. So it's easier to say, well, just give me the right system and everything will be good. But, out of these, I think it was like close to 1,500 votes, 62% said the mindset, and then there was an even split between the rest three. So it was mind-blowing to me to say, okay, we're actually telling in public that the problem starts with us. And I think that's a realization we have today that we didn't have 5 years ago. And so to me, it's of course not so good, because it means we have to change a lot with ourselves, but it's great that the awareness is now there. People are open towards changing. And it's also what we see at Business Partner Institute, that there's so many finance functions coming to us and say, help us change. Help our people understand what is the change that needs to happen, and then train them to get the skills to get there. And that awareness, that openness, it wasn't there 5 years ago. So I think it's great, but of course also means we have a lot of work to do.
I wonder if it's the same. In my relatively short career, I have worked with a lot of startups, and you always you have the cliche of move fast and break things, or be prepared to take risks. Risk taking is an important sort of part of growth, at least that's the way it's seen. And yet, when you actually apply that in the real world, a lot of the time you find people are afraid to make mistakes still, or afraid to make mistakes. I wonder if that's even more the case for finance teams, particularly people coming from, more like risk and compliance backgrounds, where really your job is to prevent mistakes, or prevent major errors. Is that part of what's where the holdup is around mindset?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone in the world that's more risk averse than accounting people and some finance people at least, but we are by nature kind of risk averse. Maybe that's why we went into this field in the first place, because we could actually use our risk averse skills for something good. But now the game is changing, right? The systems is taking care of most of it, and we just need to do exception handling, so that risk averse kind of nature is not so useful anymore. So we've set up a lot of changes more specifically to create that mindset change. And one of them is to say, stop thinking about risk as something bad, but think of risk as something neutral, and figure out what are the opportunities and what are the real risks that we definitely need to mitigate. Risk is not bad. Risk is neutral. Without risk, there's no reward. I mean, we learned that in business school, right? Without risk, there's no business. There's no free lunch, as they say, right? We have heard this quote so many times, but it is true. So if all finance is doing, going to work, is saying we need to eliminate all risk involved in this decision, well, there's no point. We're not going to create any value. So we have to shift this mindset from the no risk taking to taking the right risks. Right? That's what we're there for, helping people take the right risks. And we can do that. We are actually ideally suited to do this.
And it's a question of opportunity cost as well. I presume if you're not taking risks, you're leaving potential growth on the table.
Yes, absolutely. And so, take more risks, and yes, you will fail from time to time, but you learn from it, right? I always say to people I work with that, I love that you fail, just don't fail me twice on the same thing, because then it shows that we're not learning. And I think learning, if you look at the World Economic Forum about critical skills for the future going towards 2030, learning is the top one, right? Because things change so fast that if we don't have that learning mindset, or in popular terms, the growth mindset, we get stuck. And there's nothing worse than being stuck, because then you're not moving anywhere, right?
Is that how do finance leaders, aside from what you've already told us, how else can finance leaders work on that mindset and be prepared to take more risks or opportunities, is maybe the more neutral way of phrasing it?
Yeah, exactly. So there's sort of 4 pillars that needs to be in place, right? And that of course goes for the leaders themselves, but it also goes for their team members, right? So the first thing is people need to understand what is changing and why is it changing, and maybe most importantly, it has to make sense to them, right? If the change doesn't make sense, no change will happen. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is, am I actually seeing people around me already working in new ways, already taking a bit more risk? Do we have role models in the company that I can point my team members towards and say, these are 3 people that are already doing it, and look at the results that they have created. Try to learn from them and talk to them and see what you can do better. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, the systems and the processes and the organizational structure needs to support the new ways of working. So if you have automated a lot in your accounting team, for instance, but you don't change the tasks that your accounting team needs to work with, then it sort of defeats the purpose, right? So you need to feel supported by everything going on in the organization, that this change needs to happen. And then the last bit is that you actually get opportunity to work with these new things, right? So if you are supposed to be a business partner, do you actually have someone in the business, a sales leader, for instance, that you are a business partner to? Or is it just like another buzzword that people have brought up because they have heard from consultants that they need to do this? Then it doesn't work. And then lastly, still part of that 4th pillar is you need training to work in these new ways. And I think that's probably the worst thing that you can do, is that you tell people, we need to do something different, it all makes sense, here's what you need to do, go do it. It doesn't work like that, right? You have to have tools, templates, new ways of working, training, how to use it to get there. And I think that finance leaders are realizing that as well. We actually need to train our people, not just as a benefit, but as a real development point in what we do.
Do you see a lot of finance teams sticking with what they're doing just out of inertia? So we've talked about risk, and that's one thing, but what about just the idea that people know the way that they do things, they're comfortable with the way that they do things, and change is difficult, and wouldn't it just be easier to stick with our processes that we have today?
Absolutely, and many finance teams are doing that. I think what's different today, and again accelerated by the pandemic, is that the business leaders, they won't allow it. They expect more from finance. So I think we're seeing more often now than we did 10 years ago that CFOs, and probably also other senior finance leaders, they're getting the boot. They're getting kicked out if they're not delivering more than just control and compliance. So there's an expectation from the ones, let's say, paying the salaries, that more value comes out from the finance function. So yes, you can continue to work in the old ways, but you're going to have to find somewhere else to do it, and then you can keep running back for the rest of your career. I wouldn't find that very satisfying, but of course, I can't decide for everyone. It's better to rip off the Band-Aid and start the change. Yes, it's uncomfortable in the beginning. All growth is like that, but then it gets better.
Well, let's dive into that then. What does the rest of the company need from the CFO and from the finance function?
They need help to make better decisions, right? Of course, they can always make gut-based decisions, but they know if we make data-based decisions, it's going to be better. Of course not every decision is by default going to get better just because it's supported by data, but in general, it will get better. So they are looking for data-based insights to begin with. They're also looking for a discussion partner, right? It's one thing that a CEO or a CCO or whatever they all call it, sitting there thinking, this sounds right. I've discussed a bit with my team. We all have the same opinion that this makes sense. What do you think, finance? Well, we've considered different parts of these decisions, and here are some of the benefits that we see, and here are some of the risks that we see. So, what do you think about that? That's what they're looking for. They're looking for someone to help qualify and, of course, also quantify, is this the best decision that we can make under these circumstances? Otherwise, they can just use their experience and their gut and do it, and sometimes they will be even more right than if finance was helping. But in general, on average, that's what they're looking for.
Is that because finance actually owns the data? Finance has the numbers? Because finance has the skills, maybe, that other teams don't have? Is it a combination of both of those? Is it something else?
Yeah, it's a combination of a few things. We even call it the unfair advantage of finance, right? So something that finance has that the rest of the business and anyone else in the business, they don't have it. And the first is, we understand the business, maybe not as well as a business leader. We understand the business. We have access to financial data. Yes, we own that. But we also typically have access to non-financial data, even though we might not own it. I probably think it's a good idea if we gather data ownership in some central place, but we have access to it. Then, we also have analytical skills. So we can actually do something with this data and figure out what are the trends and patterns and whatnot in this data that we need to make sense of. Fourth, we have a cross-value chain perspective, right? So we can look across the value chain. If you're in sales, you don't. You focus on sales, and you should, because that's where your expertise is. Right? So we can look across. And the last bit is that by design, finance is typically at the tables when decisions are made. So we can choose to use that seat to actually proactively lean in to the discussion, or we can lean out and just sit and take the notes and send out, here's the summary. And many finance people have taken too much of a lean back approach, and instead they should really lean in and facilitate, if not even lead, the discussion. That's what business leaders are looking for. They would love for finance leaders to come in and facilitate business discussions around what should we do about this specific challenge that we're facing. But too often we are not. We just, maybe we're there, but we're not really using that opportunity to do something. But if you put all these things together, we have an unfair advantage in finance that no one else in the company has. Yes, they have probably other advantages, but not this one. And we need to use this unfair advantage to drive better decisions.
And you've talked about the finance function becoming a profit driver, which I suppose is sort of the opposite in my head anyway of being a risk and compliance, a risk limiter, and then a profit driver. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it doesn't mean that finance is going to be making the money, right? It's not. That's not what it's about. But it's driving that mindset of where do we create value, how can we create more value, and how can we do it together. So instead of looking at the historical numbers, it's about looking towards the future. It's about taking the right risks rather than not taking risks. It's about sharing insights, new perspectives. And I think maybe the most key shift we need to make is stop trying to succeed on our own and enabling others to succeed. The business is not there because of finance and accounting people. Finance and accounting people is there because there is a business. And yes, there is some compliance and some controlling stuff that we need to get done. We shouldn't forget that, but we're there to help them succeed, right? So, I would tell almost any finance team out there and say, you cannot be successful unless the business is successful. They say you have a stake in that, you have good customer satisfaction, and you can actually articulate what is it that you did that helped them be successful. Because if it's just sending the report and say, now you had the numbers, that's not good enough. Articulate what was your role in the business being successful. If you can do that, you are doing business partnering. You are helping the business be successful. Then you can claim, finance and accounting people, we are successful.
What are you writing about this quarter?
So I have quite a few things on my slate. So right now we're writing about frontier technologies and how they can be used in finance. Blockchain and AI and Internet of Things and all these things. How does that translate into finance? We'll also write something about coding, because I put out a poll and say, should finance and accounting people learn how to code? 2/3 said yes. I'm a bit on the fence on that, because I don't think that makes sense that we all learn how to code. We should be able to use the tools, and then maybe we should have a few specialists that want to learn how to code. I also asked, what kind of coding languages should we then learn? 50% said R or Python, so it's pushing in the data science direction. Putting those two numbers together, it basically says 1/3 of finance and accounting professionals should become data scientists. And that's madness. Yes, maybe 5 or 10% should, but that's madness. But it's such a, shiny object there for people to see, oh, this sounds cool, I need to get in on the action. So I have to write about, does that make sense or not, and what, probably why not, because as I said, I'm a bit on the fences on that. We're also going to be writing about planning. So, planning is always the topic of finance people, budgets and rolling forecast, and basically going to write that under the notion that planning is dead, because, things change so fast, so what are we even planning for? I haven't quite figured out the complete storyline yet, but that's definitely something we're going to be putting out. We're also going to dig further into the ESG topic for finance people. We wrote a bit about that last year, but we're going to dig further into that because the whole ESG thing is just such a big thing for companies in general right now that CFOs, they need to get on top of this right now, not in 6 months, not in 12 months, no, right now. So those were just a few of the topics that we are going to be putting out.
ESG jumped out to me right away. I was thinking about this last week in relation to another podcast interview. How do you think, maybe you haven't fully formulated your thesis on this yet, but how can CFOs help to lead ESG for their companies?
So I think the key point is that businesses should revamp their business model to a point where ESG is not a cost, but actually, going back to the profit driver notion, that we do ESG because it makes sense for our business, right? Because if you can get your business model to that point, then you will find everyone working towards that common goal. If you only see ESG as a cost and compliance thing, okay, we need to tick all these boxes, we're never going to get anywhere on this agenda. And there's no one better positioned in a company than the CFO to figure out how do we drive value creation through ESG. And I think, my former company, Maersk, they have done this so well that, they're not just looking at, okay, how can we save on fuel, for instance. They're actually saying, well, we save on fuel, one, of course, because it's good for the environment, but also because it's good for business. And I think they keep driving so many different new initiatives on this agenda here that it's just such a great transformation that Maersk has done, and showcasing that you can actually do good business while moving the ESG agenda in the right direction at the same time. And I think if more companies can do that, it sounds a bit silly, but then the world would be a better place.
Well, it's a nice side effect.
Exactly.
We all have a nicer world to live in. You mentioned sort of the future of technology. You mentioned blockchain, etc. Where do you think finance automation is heading in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Well, so I also ask how far can we push this rate of automation, and I think it's probably landing somewhere around 80 to 85% if companies really do it well. But of course, we also get to a point where getting that last few percentage points is going to be very expensive, at least with the technology available today. So I'm expecting in the next 2 to 3 years that the 60% goes towards 70%. And, we'll have to make conscious choices along the way of how much do we want to push this versus, make investments elsewhere. Because, just automating for the sake of automating is not always the right decision. We also have other parts of finance that needs investments, and probably the business needs investing in other bits as well.
But as you sort of suggested much earlier on in our conversation, most of the technology we have, it's there. So the change in the next few years is more about adoption. It's about people actually using what exists. I'm sure that technology will improve. Even at Spendesk, where I work, we will, of course, improve in the next 2 or 3 years. But the basics are there. The foundations are there.
Yeah, and that's also why I think we could actually see that shift from 34% to 60% in such a few years, because the tools were already there. It's not like you needed NASA to invent something, right? It's already there. So it's just about using it in the right way. And I've sort of coined this term called being a techno. So someone that knows what technology is available and how to apply it in your company. You might not know exactly how to implement it, and you're not an expert on how to run it right now, but that you can find people that can help you with that. But if you're a techno, you will always push this agenda, and you will push your automation ratios and whatever else upwards towards where it needs to be.
That's no KNOW.
Yes.
Right.
So technology knowledgeable, if you can call it like that.
All right, we're gonna wrap up in a moment, but to end every interview, we like to ask the same handful of questions. As I say every time, we call them quickfire questions. You can take as long as you like to answer them. I'll just ask them quickly. So first, what's one finance tool you couldn't live without? And please don't say Excel.
Well, so I don't do much finance work these days, but if I had to pick one, it would have to be my expense or automation app. And I'm not saying that to please anyone, but it's really just, that's one where I've experienced myself going from, such amount of paper and, error-prone processes to just having everything at your fingertip and say, okay, expense this, picture that, and then I don't have to think about it.
I promise we didn't discuss this, just for the listener, we didn't discuss this beforehand, but obviously at Svendesk, that's exactly our position as well. If you're doing expenses on paper, you're simply wasting time. Next question. If there was one part of your day-to-day you could outsource completely and forget about, what would it be?
So again, I think it's a lot of that manual work that we sometimes do, and I think the most manual work we do is probably slide production. So of course, we do training programs and do consulting gigs, and right now, we're still a small company, although growing, so we have to do a lot of the slides ourselves. And I think that would probably be the biggest thing I could outsource or something like that right now to help me in my daily work.
That would resonate. I doubt they're listening, but my colleagues in the sales world, that will resonate just deeply with them, because even if they're essentially giving the same pitch but adjusted each time or whatever, even just updating the first couple of slides of the slide deck really adds up.
Exactly.
No, it's a big opportunity.
And we are working on figuring that out, so maybe it will come not in a too distant future.
Cool. What's the best advice you've ever received?
So I'm not a big advice or quote person per se, but I guess given I'm very purpose driven myself, I guess it would have to be start with the why. I mean, if we understand why we do what we do, our life will be so much more meaningful. Then it's just about finding a platform where you can live out that why, that purpose. And that's what I found at Business Partner Institute, which I was part of founding myself. So now daily I only do things I like to do, and it's just fueling my purpose all the way. So it's a perfect situation.
At Svendesk, this is a brief aside, but our meeting rooms are all named after books, and I'm currently sitting in Start With The Why. That's the name of the room I'm sitting in.
There you go.
There you go. Again, we didn't plan that. And final question, which other finance leaders do you talk to or learn from regularly?
So, I have a huge network on LinkedIn where, I'm not going to point out any single leader per se, but I really learned so much from my network, right? So I would post questions or topics for discussion, and sometimes it's a poll. For instance, we learned about the mindset, right? I would thought it'd be something completely different, or I would just post a normal post and people will comment. So that's really, it's the sum of all those engagement and learnings that shapes my thinking about things, right? So for instance, just going back on that mindset poll, if that one had landed 25, 25, 25, 25 on those 4 options, I wouldn't have learned anything really, right? But now it says 62% of mindset. And that was so defining for a lot of the content that I put out last year, that's how the poll turned out. So really, to anyone out there listening who's following me or engaging with my content, it's all because of you.
I think that will resonate really strongly with the members of the CFO Connect community for whom we create this podcast. That's obviously, we've said the community exists for the same reason, so that people can learn from each other. If you are a member of that community, or if you do enjoy that content, this podcast, all the work that we do, I highly, highly recommend that you follow Anders on LinkedIn, because the sort of the topics and the themes are familiar to me, but often the conversations are quite different. Exactly as you said, mindset being just such a big blinking red light of something that needs to be worked on was not something that we were talking about previously. So I highly, highly recommend everybody checks out Anders' LinkedIn profile.
Thanks, Patrick.
Well, and it's I need to be thanking you, Anders Liu-Lindberg. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Patrick. It was a lot of fun.